I'm just going live now. Okay, we're live. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to a new episode of Epistemics, one that's not been done in person. We're probably online. Obviously, we're in the midst of this coronavirus outbreak, so this is the best we can do, but it's really good, alhamdulillah. So today, I'm joined by brother Yusuf Ponders. Assalamu alaikum, bro.
Wa alaikum salam.
How's it going?
Alhamdulillah, it's good. How are you?
How's quarantine? Alhamdulillah, I'm good. How's quarantine?
Same as every other day at the moment. Not much different happen over here.
Alhamdulillah. You know, some people, they actually, it's strange, but some people actually prefer, those that are sort of more introverted, they like staying at home, being by themselves. So what side of the fence are you on?
I'm already quite introverted. Well, there was someone got me to do a personality test, and I came out as like INTFJ or something. I don't know if anyone knows what that means, but it means that I'm good at being sociable, but I like to be alone. So
okay, so a bit both.
I can socialize when I need to, but then I need my breaks, and I'll recede and disappear into the shadows.
Brilliant. Okay, I think I'm probably similar as well, bro. I like my alone time as well sometimes, just like cut off from the world and be by yourself. But anyway, bro, let's get into today's discussion. I know there's another live stream going on as well, mashallah, which is Brother Sabur Ahmed's live stream on Darwinian Delusions.
Yeah, we slid in with the eyeball.
We did, but we thought might as well make a start, because otherwise we may be starting at 7 p.m. or something by the looks of things. So I know this may sort of mean people have to be in two places at once, but let's see how it goes, inshallah. So what I want to talk about today with you, Yusuf, is the topic of nihilism. I know you've studied it officially, like academically. You know, I think you've got your master's in. Did you do your master's?
No,
your degree.
I'm applying for my master's at the moment.
Right.
So inshallah, depending if I can get funding, that might happen. But that's a big if at the moment. But yeah, no, I've just got a BA in philosophy.
Okay, brilliant. But you studied nihilism in particular. You focused in on that for your dissertation as well. Is that correct?
My third year. There was 4 units. One of them was a dissertation, and that dissertation was on the subject of nihilism in particular, or how to respond to nihilism. Okay,
brilliant. So, bro, what I want to talk about today is let's start off by defining nihilism. I know it's a big task to do, because the word itself may mean many things to many different people. But how would you define nihilism? What is nihilism according to you?
Well, there's different kinds of nihilism. There's one that kind of encompasses it all. When I'm talking about nihilism, I'm just talking about the general ones. So the life is meaningless. Everything is pointless. There are no objective morals. There are no, existentially, there is just no point to anything. And it's generally what most of the existential philosophers are trying to respond to. When they're talking about, like, well, how do we, if everything is meaningless, how do we instill meaning in our lives again, quote unquote, knowing this is to be the case? And it generally follows from Nietzsche, who made the affirmation or the claim that God is dead. And he's talking not in a literal sense, but more in response to the end of faith in Western Europe, in particular, with Christianity. And so that would be nihilism, existential nihilism, moral nihilism. Okay. You know, the belief that nothing is significant, there is no value anymore. And just the rejection of meaning.
So it's good you touched upon Nietzsche. I think that's a good place to start, bro, because Nietzsche was an interesting character, right? Probably one of his most interesting, or his most famous or infamous sayings, God is dead. That's stuck, right? And many atheists actually appeal to that as well. What do you think Nietzsche meant by this? What's your take on it? Because I know it's because according to me, I think it's quite misunderstood. He was trying to get across a certain message to a certain group of people. But I want to get your take on it. What do you take from that? What did you make of his saying God is dead?
Well, to begin with, it's probably good to kind of point out Nietzsche was everyone's enemy, pretty much. Like, there isn't some group of people or that didn't end up getting critiqued to some level by Nietzsche. And so this is why you'll often see atheists use him, but you'll also see theists like refer to him as well. Because there is, his work was quite expansive, and it covered a lot of different areas. With regards specifically to his saying that God is dead, this is derived out of his aphorism about the madman. And he's talking in the sense that, like I say, it's not literal. He doesn't think, because obviously if you believe God is dead and you're taking this literally, you could say, oh, well, God was alive. But what God are we talking about here? If God can die, then we're not really talking about God. He's not speaking about that. He's talking literally just about the end of faith in Christianity, in Western religion. And so for him, God is dead just means that we're going into a new phase where what we held as significant, the things that were our highest values have been lost. And we're now at a stage, what he described as kind of a drifting through the void. There is no up, there's no down. Everything becomes arbitrary. And that inevitably, this is something that's going to encompass the whole of Europe, and that they will need to respond to it. And so a lot of his work was an attempt to respond to this this phenomena that was occurring, in terms of Europe in general. And so he comes up with certain philosophies like the Übermensch as a response to this kind of thing. It's Übermensch, before that you have like the last man, and then eventually you have this kind of response to nihilism. But in order to respond to it, he thought you had to go through it. So you had to experience it, affirm it, and kind of accept it as a way of life. But it's interesting as well, like people, they will refer to him often as an atheist, but he's not that. He's more of in his work, he's more doing sociology. So he's just kind of looking at the world, describing what he's seeing. And he even said at one point that he does, it might very well be the case that God does exist. But, that's not his claim. He's not making arguments to prove that God doesn't exist. He's not making arguments to tell you that you shouldn't believe. He's just saying that inevitably Europe is going to end up in this position where they're just ultimately nihilistic. They they have no way of directing themselves anymore, so they have to rely basically upon themselves and try to figure out how to self-direct.
You know what, I think that's very interesting, because that analysis, bro, is quite intuitive and rational when you think about it. Because it's interesting, because Professor Ken James, one of the leading experts on Nietzsche, he makes this point. He said when Nietzsche said God is dead, he was specifically talking to those that already rejected God, those secularists. And he was essentially telling them, or trying to highlight, that what's going to happen now, like you said, the prediction that the coming decades are going to be extremely nihilistic, because once you've killed God, you've killed any anchor or grounding for morals, for any meaning, essentially. And I think that's quite an intuitive and rational understanding when you logically follow through. But what's interesting, bro, you don't see most atheists following through with what seems to be quite obvious. Now, do you think this is deliberate? Do you think they don't want to focus on this, or that they have thought about it but they understand the implications, therefore don't focus on it and brush it aside? What do you think is going on?
Well, firstly, I'd probably say it's not even that we can quantify it. We can't say most atheists. I would say personally, most atheists are a silent majority. They're not necessarily active on social media, shouting in the comment section, like tweeting at people about how they need to become atheists. They're not, they're not doing atheist dower for the most part. They're just living life, being whoever they're being, not or indifferent about apologetics, and not really engaging in it. And for them, like basically nihilism, we're talking about Nietzsche again, it's something that is coming whether or not someone even identifies themselves as a nihilist. Nihilist is like a psychological reaction to being overwhelmed by too much information, too much choice, too much freedom, too much this, too much that. And so they're being affected by nihilism, whether or not they realize it. And a lot of people, they're not necessarily thinking too much about it. And when you're looking at the active or the activist atheist who's trying to do the atheist hour, the apologetics, they're not kind of submitting to it because probably they're finding meaning in life through their activism, through their kind of shouting at people about it or trying to bring people over to their way and so on and so forth. But in general, yeah, it's a weird one. Because it does come across sometimes like they are being inconsistent. Like Nietzsche, he was quite happy to admit it. There are some academics who are openly nihilist. I'm reading a book by Nolan Gertz at the moment who talks about nihilism and technology, and he's kind of exploring how technology might be facilitating our nihilism. And so there are people who are open to it and they're consistent in that sense. But then you look at, say, like the popular new atheists like Richard Dawkins and things like that, they don't seem to acknowledge it at all. But I think it is quite honest if they do, because as far as I can see, it does seem to kind of root everything. If you reject God, if you reject like a transcendent anchor and all you have is materialism, all you have is this world, all that ends up anchoring it is the intersubjective or the collective. And then that obviously varies from people to people from time to time. And it makes it difficult to say, oh, well, this is why you should accept our particular moral system or our particular value system over that one. And as far as I can see, it generally boils down to, what each group of people desire collectively as a goal. And also it's the will to power, who has the the biggest force behind them, who has the greater army, who has the biggest economic influence. How can you manipulate and get your way by threats, be that physical or economic, etc. And if they could see that and like kind of admit to it, then it kind of becomes a bit more dull and not very nice.
So there's a question, bro. I think this is quite an interesting question. Maybe we'll discuss this further on in the discussion. But Hassan says, how to give da'wah to someone who's a nihilist? What would be the best way according to you? So as a general point, if you were to give someone some advice, a Muslim some advice on talking to nihilists, how would you approach it?
Well, it depends on the nihilist. Some people are so far down the rabbit hole that it's only themselves that can really do the saving. You can only really stand at the sidelines and watch. But generally, it's just treating them well. So you're making the effort with them, rush to get them some food. Like if you're eating out with them, be the first to pay. Show them good etiquette, because this is something that really pulls people, and they can incline towards you simply because you're treating them well. And then it's a case of just talking to them about things. As like I say, being a nihilist isn't something that you can choose necessarily. If you're choosing it, you're already undermining yourself. Because to admit that one is a nihilist is to kind of as well look at the world through the meaningful lens of nihilism. So when Nietzsche's talking about it, he's not saying you should hold it as if like it's a badge that you can pick. Something that's forced upon you. And if you're trying to do dawah to a nihilist, you need to kind of just get to the bottom of why is it they're associating themselves with such a tag. And it generally just involves conversation, getting to know their past, their history, speaking to them about that. And you'll maybe find reasons that pop up that have made them inclined to that. Probably some trauma, something that's overwhelmed them. They've tried to take up a task and they've kind of discovered that the task was impossible. And so they just kind of give up and go, it's all pointless. What's the point? Why should I even bother? And especially when you look at, there's a really good example of this when you're trying to get through to say like a celebrity, and like if you're on, like you're just to get them to hear your voice, and it's just you're being drowned out by the millions of voices that are being thrown at their direction. Like if anyone's ever tried to, Jordan Peterson, for example, I think I tried to comment on something and tried to get him to engage in something I said, and there was just no way of getting it to him because there was just too much going on. And you think, what's the point? And it's similar in terms of life. When you're trying to do something which makes you feel like you're a significant individual, and there are certain popular figures that really beat people down with this. So another thing is they'll often talk about how insignificant you are, and they talk about it as if it's like this amazing thing. The guy did it in your debate. We talked about it briefly. And he's like, "Oh, but it's you're so insignificant. Like if you look at everything out there, what are you in comparison?" And it's like, well, you could look at it another way. Like you could look at it from the perspective of, well, look at all that is out there that's just empty space, and
therefore how significant are you?
Like if this is the only place, or one of the only few places, if you look at it in terms of percentage, how much of the universe has got life in it, and if life is rare, then you could look at life as significant, as valuable, because as far as we're concerned, the value is in the rarity of things. So if life isn't common in the universe at all, that's a reason to see it as something valuable, as something significant. And if it is significant, then there's meaning to it. You can have an effect on the people around you. You can do good. You can help people. You can reduce their angst, their anxieties, things like that.
So some beautiful points you mentioned there, bro. One thing I want to do now is after this particular question about blazing heat, or the point I think is quite interesting that he makes about Nietzsche, and I think this point sort of broadens out a bit, especially when you go to the 17th and 18th century. The predominant rise, or that movement we saw against religion and this movement towards atheism, a lot of it seems to be a result of a reaction to the church and the persecution of the church in history, to free thinking, etc., and just the general corruption that was being demonstrated. I was reading a really interesting book by something McGrath. I don't remember the author's name. He's got a book called The Twilight of Atheism, and it's very interesting because he goes back to the French Revolution and he shows that how it was a corruption of the church which resulted in and led to people rebelling against religion as a whole and God as well, and turning towards atheism. But there were many philosophers at the time that didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They sort of understood, hold on to this type of natural theology where they believed in God still, based on just observing the world and the universe around them. But they rebelled against religion, in particular Christianity, because of what the church was doing at the time. The question here, Blazing Heat asks, is in some way Nietzsche, or what he was upon, a reaction to Christianity. What's your take on that, bro? What would you say in regards to that?
So you mentioned before we move on to that bit, you mentioned the French Revolution, for example, and that wasn't even necessarily just because of the church. So it was more, from what I can remember, King Louis, he was trying to create unity, and he found a massive problem with the Protestants, and so he began to persecute the Protestants, and he wanted basically France to become a Catholic nation again. And so a lot of the Protestants would start to flee and things like that. And he engaged in things like book burning, and there was lots of stuff going on there. So that may have been one thing, like one of the first dominoes that kind of led to what was going on there. And they were obviously, the kings were living in these massive, huge palaces, while people were struggling to eat. There was massive disparity. The kings, the royalty, were really focused on making things even more beautiful. They were trying to build something that the world would look at in awe, and they just saw the struggles of the general populace as necessary in order for this glory, in order to fulfill this thing that no other country has ever established before. And with that, you see these things start to kind of arise, and you see it with the rise of communism. Like it's generally the disparity or the wealth gaps between the ruling class and the lower class that kind of cause these tensions, and especially when the ruling class are kind of showing it off. You know, they're not trying to hide their wealth. They're not trying to, like stop people from feeling even poorer than they are. But they're actively like putting it out on the pedestal, on the forefront, in the public eye. Now, with regards to Nietzsche being a reaction to Christianity, I think the reaction was already happening, and he was observing it, and he was just the first one to kind of like start to acknowledge it. So it wasn't so much that he was the beginning, but he was definitely like a catalyst in some sense, helping it along. And if anything, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, it was Christianity that gave rise to its own end. There's a book by one of my teachers who wrote an introduction to Nietzsche. I can't remember the name of it exactly. Starting with Nietzsche by Ulrich Hasse. And he talks about it in the sense that basically Christianity gave rise and turned its sting upon itself. Mm-hmm. And so there were certain things that they held as higher values, which eventually undermined it. And it transformed Christianity into science. And so what's often talked about is as if science is somehow a separate entity that was created to sort of battle religion, battle Christianity. And, that it didn't have its roots in Christianity or anything like that. It was just it formed independently to defeat it, and it won. Nietzsche's saying that that's not the case at all. What he says is, what is science as we know it today in the West is the transformation of Christianity after the death of God. And so it still holds particular values without necessarily explaining why it holds them. So, for example, the will to truth. Why value truth? Mm-hmm. That will to truth was something that the scientific community in the West adopted from their Christian roots. Christianity made the will to truth an important thing, and they put it at the top of their value hierarchy. And it's this will to truth that eventually turned its sting upon itself and led people to kind of give or remove themselves and move away from Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so the scientific community is basically what he refers to as the corpse of Christianity. It's the remains of Christianity after the death of God.
It's interesting.
And so it's a transformation. It's a metamorphosis of something from one kind of being into another kind of being. And the point is here is that, like, why value truth? Truth isn't necessarily something that is going to give a society success. Mm-hmm. It can undermine societies. So, like, for example, in terms of the USSR, there was certain truths that they needed to hide in order to sustain themselves towards the end, and it was the revealing of these truths which crippled it. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, a lot of the assumptions that they made with regards to the nature of the human being. Like Marx, he often talks in ways as if he thought that capitalism gave rise to greed. Mm-hmm. So he got, Nietzsche says he got the consequences. Well, he's not talking about Marx in general, but socialists. I don't think he knew Marx existed. But he says the socialists or the communists, they confuse causes with consequences. Mm-hmm. And so they say that capitalism gave rise to greed rather than greed was already present in the human being, and then that gave rise to capitalism. And so truth is itself something that can undermine a society. It can, depending on what kind of society you're dealing with. And there are always active elements within societies to kind of cover this truth up. And I think you're seeing it today as well in modern secular society. They're just kind of going on about, we're dedicated to truth. But then you look at certain things. My wife watched a documentary yesterday on, they banned porn recently in South Korea. And then there's been a massive rise in spy cameras being placed all over the place in South Korea. and people basically recording lewd things of women when they're not knowing that it's happening. And so this has had a massive spike. And I can guarantee you that this is going to be used by liberals as an example of why porn should be allowed, rather than seeing this as the consequence of porn being in effect in the first place, and that you're going to have to go through a teething period of dealing with the population going through cold turkey. Because it's in Asian, well, all over the world at the moment, with the rise of things like porn, with the rise of things like internet, gaming, and stuff like that, young men are finding it extremely difficult to communicate with women. And so, they a lot of them are becoming more introverted. And they spend all their times indoors playing on computer games, relying on porn for their intimate side of things. And you see massive drops in birth rates in places like Japan, South Korea. People aren't getting married as often, and they have issues with birth rates to the point where it looks like they're going to end up with a very old population, where basically most of the people that live in those societies are going to be elderly, and there's not going to be many young people helping sustain them, which is dangerous, because if that's the case, societies can collapse. When people get old, they're not old enough to work. And the elderly generally tend to have to rely on like a strong youth that is able to kind of sustain them as they get older. But and so this is the thing. And so rather than kind of accepting that these things are causing problems to the society, they say that they value truth, but that truth would undermine the society, and so they focus on other things. So they're focusing on the moment on freedom. Or they'll focus on security.
But it's very interesting, bro. So what we're seeing, sorry, but on what you're saying right there, it's almost like when you've removed that when you've removed God from the picture, that underpinning, that ought, that presses down on someone, right, is removed. So you may say something, or you may claim a value or a proposition, but because you removed God from the picture, you can basically do away with those ideas as and when you wish, because there's nothing binding you, there's nothing that's grounding you anymore, because without God, it's essentially there is no anchor anymore, right? So and is that what you're trying to highlight, that
the anchor becomes like Nietzsche says, there is no up, there is no down, like which direction do we walk now? And it becomes up to the people themselves. You look at the UK as an example of that. There's a massive rise in atheism here, and there's a look at democracy, and it's expressing itself very strangely. And then you look at Brexit as an example of this. So we're talking about freedom and about the people being self-willed. And it's gone to such an extent where we make these absurd decisions. So, like, for me, I didn't vote in Brexit, and I don't feel, and I looked into it. I probably, or may, have known more about the issues than the average UK citizen, who hasn't looked into it at all and has just kind of listened to hearsay and blah blah blah, and they voted Brexit because they don't want immigrants, or they've voted against Brexit and Remain because they don't want to come across as racist or whatever. And I still didn't feel like I was in a position to be able to make an educated decision on what was the best for the country. And it felt strange to me that it had been put upon the populace in the first place, because I don't think the majority of people have any idea of the consequences, and that they were going to rely on more arbitrary reasons as to why we should incline in one direction or the other, not really understanding the consequences. But for whatever reason, it was given to the entire populace to decide, rather than giving it to a group of experts. Democracy is becoming very strange, and we're just kind of assuming that a group of people in a collective know what's best for them. But that, in history, that's shown not always to be the case. People can lead themselves off of a mountain, off a cliff edge together, and if you're just in this herd mentality, you can all walk off the edge together, and not be able to prevent it once it starts happening. Sorry, what was the initial question again? I went on a bit of a tangent.
So I forgot the initial question too, but it was to do with sort of underpinning. So the underpinnings of the
Oh
so
yeah. Yeah. It was a bit like, if you've not got God, then everything becomes free reign, and it's like, well, where do we anchor it then?
Yeah.
And so you can choose to anchor it in an authority, and that authority can be like a ruler, a king.
Yeah, no, but I think there is amongst some facets.
People.
I think amongst some facets, it's almost a good thing that you can't underpin it, because that way, you know, you can go whichever way, you can swing whichever way you like, whatever brings benefit to a certain group, essentially, I guess. But one thing I want to direct the conversation to now, bro, is nihilism is, generally speaking, it's quite a broad term. It's like an umbrella term, right? When you can have different types of aspects of nihilism. So I want to focus in on existential nihilism for a second. And when I say that, what I mean by that is life itself having meaning and purpose, or ultimate meaning and purpose, right? So we can have this moral nihilism, but let's put all of that aside for a second. Let's really sort of discuss this existential type of nihilism, because what appeals to the personal, the self, is probably the most important thing. It's where we should start. When it comes to existential nihilism, now the way I see it, and from what I've thought about it and experienced, what I've experienced of it myself, and I think reading Albert Camus as well, some of his works, it seems like it's a logical end for someone that believes that there is no creator, there is no God, and that therefore existence is just one big cosmic accident. If that's the outlook you have, then it's almost an inevitable logical conclusion that if you logically follow through, that's where you would end up, that life has no ultimate meaning or purpose. Now, what you do from that point is a different discussion. And I think that we should get into this as well, because like some of the existentialist philosophers, they said, fine, okay, life has no meaning or purpose, but at this point is where we start now. We basically make purpose for ourselves. We give ourselves purpose. You know, yeah. They would present this sort of idea in a very or they would try at least to present it in a very uplifting, empowering way, which you pointed out. Albert Camus sort of fails in doing so after digging the hole so deep himself in the first part.
Yeah, my experience of his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, I loved the book. It was a great one. Like, he's a really good writer. Like, he says very poetic things, and there's a bit in where he starts talking about the scientist is telling him about this and that and the atoms, and eventually, eventually he gets to a bit where he's like, you've gone beyond our horizon, and you've had to resort to art. You've had to resort to metaphor in order to express something. And another thing he mentioned was the issue with the human's capacity to reason. And so you see this, people put rationality at the top of our hierarchy, and they have this assumption that all truths are available to the human intellect, you know, with reason, and you can just kind of work your way to truths. And there's a problem with that, in the fact that it's not obviously the case at all. And there are good cases to say that, you know, I would incline to the conclusions that many truths are not rationally available, and that you can even constantly, you know, for the atheist, for example, Albert Camus being not a theist at all, in his book he starts to talk about how whatever you talk about in philosophy, no matter what route you go, whatever path you turn down, you always end up in paradoxes. You always end up in these weird places where it's like, you know, these irresolvable issues. And this is, again, something that leads him in particular to nihilism. It's like, I can't rely on the sciences. I can't rely on reason and rationality. You know, I can't rely on anything. There's nothing. And this is what kind of builds up this experience of nihilism for him. And it ties into the fact that when it comes to trying to understand a particular thing, you need knowledge. And a lot of things we just don't have knowledge of. And so we can come up to these conflicts where it seems like there's a paradox. We touched on this in the video that we did together, that you posted. And the experience of this paradox and the tensions that arise there, the tensions are internal. You know, the world itself isn't experiencing these tensions. It might very well be the case that these two things can coincide. The tension that we're experiencing is an anxiety of our limits, from what I can make out. And this is the being overwhelmed. This is the being confronted with the void. I can't get past this bit. This is a wall. And in order to kind of make sense of things, you really, internally that you need to traverse that wall, but it's not possible. You can't get that information. You can't just will it into being in front of you. Sometimes it's just out of your reach. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist. It might very well be the case that the answers, are somewhere out there, but they're just, we don't have the tools or the capacity to be able to find them. And it's this that kind of leads to this exhaustion. So, and it's the Dunning-Kruger effect is like when you start quite confident and then you start to kind of study a subject, and then all of a sudden you realize how much there is to know, how much you don't know. And I touched on this in my last video on my channel, my live stream. I had to kind of explain to people that just because, say, for example, you've got a bachelor's degree in a particular subject, it doesn't mean you know everything about that subject. People who have a bachelor's degree in a subject know more than anybody else how little they know about that subject. Yeah. And like once you've got your degree, you don't feel like you know a lot at all. Like there's so many things that you had to brush over. There's so much you had to rush through to try and get a particular essay done on time. There's so much I had to neglect, like lectures you didn't turn up to, targeted reading you didn't do just because you didn't have the time. Like you had targets to try and hit. And so sometimes having a degree in something gives this illusion that you know more than you do. Yeah. And like, and then it's the same thing with, like even the some of the ulama, like they spent their entire lives studying the deen, and they still didn't feel like at the end of it that they had achieved much. Like, and it's this exhaustion, and then people kind of revert away from it, and they get tired, exhausted, and sometimes they'll incline towards this nihilism. Look, oh, what's the point? Like,
yeah. So look, I think there's some very interesting points you're mentioning. See, one of the things that really interests me as well, when it comes to someone experiencing the absurd or an existential crisis, right? When they get to that point where that moment of realization hits them, oh, my life doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't have any purpose, ultimate purpose, right? What interests me is that the discomfort of that experience that person feels, it doesn't settle. It's not good enough, right? And it sort of ties into what you're saying as well. It's not good enough. There's an agitation. And like Camus says as well, it becomes a passion when you hit the absurd, when you experience it for the first time. You can't escape it. It becomes your focus. That this understanding that life has no meaning, at least from the perspective of certain worldviews, or if you look at it from the perspective of certain worldviews. Now, when you get to that point, what fascinates me is why this discomfort with this realization, right? That agitation, that dissonance. To me, it suggests that there is something in that realization or that understanding or that conclusion that life has no meaning, which goes against human nature, your nature as a human being, right? And that sort of suggests that the human being is a creature that's driven by purpose. And you can look at it on different levels, right? Even the things that we do on an hourly basis, on a daily basis, it's all purpose driven. When we see things in nature and the world around us, we ascribe purpose to those things. When we make things with purpose, right? So it's almost like a driving force for human beings, this concept and idea of purpose and an objective. But
we have a will to meaning.
Yeah.
Is Viktor Frankl, and I've told you about him, and we need to do like a little reading session on his book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
And he talks about it, and I agree that there's an internal recognition that we are significant, and the issue is when the contrary is kind of being forced down your throat.
Yeah.
And one of the issues is that like we are social beings, and a lot of people submit to authority to a certain degree, or to what they see as like an authority. And so if someone you respect, if someone you see as cool or whatever is telling you a particular thing, you'll swallow it. And you see this with celebrity culture. Like if, oh, you need to buy this t-shirt, you're not relevant if you don't. You know, people have this desire to become significant, and they feel the only way to do that is by buying this guy's merch, or whatever. And it is that we have this drive in us for meaning, for significance. With pattern recognition machines. You know, like everything, like you say, has purpose in it when we see it. Everything is, you know, even from a very early age. This isn't something that you have to be given. This is something you're born with. You see patterns, you see recognition. My daughter, she'll look at things and she'll organize buttons. Like with my mum, my grandma had a big box of buttons, and we're not telling her to do this, but she'll walk over and she'll start picking up certain buttons and organizing them into piles of similarity. Like, and this is a drive within her, just as we have this drive within us to learn, or to learn language. You know, we don't. I don't have to go over and insert a particular chip into my daughter so that she gets this drive to want to learn how to speak. You know, she has it within her as a part of her being. It's encoded into her, and it's the same with meaning, with significance. You seek out that which is significant. You seek out purpose because it's within you. And so when you get this kind of movement that's trying to say the complete opposite, it causes attention, it causes an anxiety, and the reason it causes attention is because there is the element within us, within our very nature, within our being, that is saying the contrary, and then people can submit to it. And like, so generally you look at, say, modern politics, and people kind of incline towards this utilitarianism. You saw it in the debate between Sabor, Cosmic Skeptic. He's, you know, big on utilitarianism, and you see the rise of veganism, which is underpinned by this idea of utilitarianism. It all boils down to this idea of pleasure and pain. We need to increase pleasure, and we need to reduce pain. And this is just kind of, to me, as far as I can see, it's incredibly naive philosophy that completely overlooks the entire history of like humanity, in terms of most people lived in, you know, there was constant suffering around them all the time. If they lived as utilitarians and, you know, pleasure wasn't available to them, they'd all commit suicide. So you look, like, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the film Joker, the Joker was a nihilist. He was full on. And so people say what we need to do is we need to convince people that, no, you shouldn't go out and you shouldn't cause damage. You shouldn't harm the society and the people around you for your own pleasure. Because if you do that, it's not going to benefit the pleasures in, you know, overall. Now you look at the Joker. If you have a society that is not necessarily, they don't value education as much as you do. They don't value rational discussion, this, that, and the other. But they've just, you know, they're very simple people. They're caught up in their own lives, because we can't have everyone in the society being an academic, you know, going to university, dealing with these complex concepts. We need people working normal jobs. You know, the economy needs it. And like, you rely on the economy being good in order to get food coming in. We need people doing this and that and the other. And so you can't expect everyone to be like massively intellectual. But then that comes with issues. If everyone isn't really that bothered about being massively intellectual, then when they hear things like, oh, the meaning of life is just to increase pleasure, they don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to go down that rabbit hole and to understand that certain sacrifices need to be made in order to sustain long-term, quote-unquote, pleasures.
Yep.
And when they hear these things, when they hear stuff like utilitarianism being pushed, there's no reason why they should think that, well, why shouldn't I just party? Well, you know, like, I've spent all week doing this job. I hate this job. It causes me so much pain. Like, at the end of the week, during the weekend, what can I do to make myself feel good again? Why shouldn't I just go out and get drunk? Why shouldn't I just do this, do that, take drugs? And, you know, that someone might come along and say, but if you don't, you know, in the long term, it's like, in the long term, what? If I'm doing this job 9 to 5, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any of this. Like, where else am I getting pleasure from, other than like through hedonistic pursuits?
Yeah.
Like, I can't, there is nothing else available to me. You keep telling me to wait for what? And especially if you live in a society where people are all thinking like this. It's this dog eat dog world. I grew up in a council estate, and it could be like that very much. And if you live in a society where everyone is just treating you badly, where no one seems to care about you, people are ridiculing you. They laugh at you. They take the mick out of you, like the Joker. He seems in the film like just this normal guy just trying to get by. He's got issues. There's things wrong. Like he's got that thing wrong with him where he starts to laugh in situations where he shouldn't. It causes him trouble. People beat him up. Like, how can you tell him that he shouldn't just do what's going to make him happy now? And what if revenge is what's going to please him? Mm-hmm. What if he sees the society as wicked? Yeah. Why should he sacrifice anything for them? Why shouldn't he take his revenge? Why shouldn't he do whatever it is that he wants to do? If these sacrifices are only causing him more pain, and there's no recovery from that. And you see it. Eventually, he gives up. Eventually, he snaps, and like he becomes psychotic, and he goes on that show and he just blows that guy's head off. Mm. Why shouldn't he do that in a society where no one gives a crap about him? Mm. And this is the issue: is that they just assume tradition is bad. We need to get away from that. We need to be progressive. We'll start from scratch, and we'll use all of this and blah 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 blah. Not really thinking that maybe these traditions developed over a long period of time through trial and error, and that somehow that whatever we ended up with, the you're now trying to reject, is through the basis of what was successful, what gave rise to the biggest pleasure in a society where there was just constant pain and suffering. Like, why are you assuming that wasn't the purpose of all of these things previously? And it seems counterintuitive because a lot of it's about withholding yourself from pleasure, about sacrificing pleasures for greater good. And I made this point with Sabor that maybe utilitarianism in the end leads back to the very thing we're trying to avoid, back to like a more conservative lifestyle. And for me, it's not about, 'cause this is another thing that people have messaged me a lot. There's been some emails coming through, people wanting me to talk about things like depression and happiness and things like that. And this is something that Viktor Frankl also hones in on. He says one of the biggest problems, and this is an issue with the effects of kind of America with this, the pursuit of happiness. Like, happiness is the thing that you should aim at, the thing itself that you need to move towards. You need to make happiness your goal. Happiness isn't a goal. Happiness is a consequence of reaching goals. And so if you make happiness the goal itself, it becomes like a dog chasing its tail. Like you're not like, if happiness is the consequence of achieving something, how are you supposed to achieve it by making it the goal?
It's as soon as you say the pursuit of happiness, you're chasing a ghost basically, because you'll never arrive there. You'll never reach there.
Because it's a consequence of achieving significance in other things that are themselves not happiness. Mm-hmm. The achieve. It's like, and a lot of it sometimes is overcoming struggle, overcoming something hard, facing it head on, being brave, being strong. And you don't have to be like a big, like a gym head, like beefcake out of your head to be strong. Like, you can be like a skinny 6 foot stone person and still be brave, still be strong, still face adversity, stress, pain, struggle head on. And this is what the people of the past did. There was all sorts going on. We, in comparison, we're still like children even when we get to the ages of 25, 30, 40. I know 50, 60-year-olds that still act like teenagers. And the reason is because we're mollycoddled. Like the story of Buddha here, the first one, there was this guy who came along and he gave a prediction that his son, the king's son, is going to grow up either to be a great conqueror or a great spiritual man.
It's a little one.
Yes, either he's going to grow up to be a great ruler or a great spiritual man. And the king wanted him to be a great ruler. And so what did he do? He put his son into a palace and protected him. And so, bear with me. And it ended up having the opposite effect. It ended up making him, like, he left the palace. He wanted nothing to do with it. In the end, he ran from it, and he ran headlong in the opposite direction. He ended up starving himself to the point where he became like a skeleton. And if any of you have ever seen the idol of Buddha, where he looks like skin and bones, that's the process of him kind of joining these people in the middle of nowhere, where they practiced extreme avoidance, where they avoided pleasures completely.
But I think, yeah, sorry, but I think we're getting to there's two things that are emerging from this discussion so far, which I think are very interesting. It seems to be a combination. So the way we see society today, it seems to be, or the state of society today seems to be a combination of two things that we're discussing here, which are sort of emerging. Number one is to turn away from or deny God, which leads to this type of nihilism, which puts you in this sort of a world without any ought, or a world without any significant underpinning drive, right? And secondly, it seems like the excessive luxuries of life which surround us almost diffuse or render the human being stale, just render him almost what's the word I'm looking for? Almost without
hollow,
any substance. Yeah, hollow, exactly. Yeah. And it's very interesting because when you look at the time of revelation, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and sometimes they ask, well, why did God choose to reveal the revelation to the Arabs in the middle of the desert when there were so many other people on so many other civilizations on the face of this earth? But something very interesting is when you study those civilizations, you would see, for example, the Romans and the Persians, they were affluent, they were rich, they were living in luxury, right? But one thing that resulted in was they became very hollow, like you said, inactive, unpassionate. They didn't have no passion. They had no drive. Yeah. But the Arabs were different because they weren't used to the luxuries of the life. They didn't have this stuff. And you would notice there's records of kings or rulers in Persia and in the Roman empires, when they would say some absurd things and the people would just follow and obey, even if they knew it was wrong. But the Arabs, if you look at their interactions with their kings and their leaders, if the king said something which is wrong, they would speak out against the king. So because they weren't made almost impotent and put in this state where they just were ineffective, just that's hollow. Again, that's the best way I can think of it. But so that seems to be the case. Yeah, go on, bro.
You see it as well in like the unwillingness to bow to royalty. Like there's like someone will say that like royalty will often expect people to kind of bow to them and show respect, and the Muslims, they weren't for doing that. They were like, no, we bow only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And and it is this this is what makes us equal. Like we're all servants of God, and you can say what you want, but if you're wrong, and if it's something that's going to lead me to evil, to injustice, to doing wrong to people, like you do what you want to me. And obviously there were people that didn't that would succumb. But there was I can't remember his name, the scholar who was being persecuted because he wouldn't say that the Quran was created. I don't know. In the chat, if anyone, there's someone definitely knows. There's always one person that knows everything in the chat. But there was the scholar, and basically they were saying, no, listen, you better submit to our position. Stop saying that the Quran is the eternal world, the eternal word, or uncreated, or we'll torture you. And like he refused. I think they even put him to death eventually.
Someone said Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, possibly he was the individual you referred to.
Muhammad Maher. Assalamu alaikum, Muhammad as well. He's a good brother.
So, and bro, we see this amongst the scholars. Like there will be Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, was there was many times that other scholars disagreed with him completely, and they would stand their ground if they believed what they were saying was sincere and true,
and they were sincere about it. And
yeah, absolutely. So, bro, let's bring it to a close now. I think one direction I just want to sort of bring it to is if we go back to that point about where, say, you're an atheist, you adopt atheism, or by extension, or more specifically, naturalism, right? Which is that everything can be explained by physical processes. Yeah. And which is quite popular these days amongst many people, and it's of different levels. But say if you're of that persuasion and you become an atheist or you're a naturalist, and you've sat down and you've thought about your position, and you've thought about, or you've sort of analyzed life and the meaning of life or juxtaposed it with your worldview of naturalism or atheism, and say you've come to the logical conclusion, well, if I hold on to atheism or naturalism, there is no ultimate meaning or purpose to life, and you've ended up coming to this conclusion rationally, and then, but at the same time, it's not okay. It doesn't feel right. You feel the pain and the anxiety that results from this. Every part of your being and your soul screaming out to you and saying to you, this could not be the case. There has to be purpose. There has to be meaning. Now, in this case, if we pause that scenario for a second, now there's a few streams or directions people could go in, right? One of the directions is the direction we saw some of the existentialist philosophers take. Well, okay, we accept this. There is no meaning or purpose to life, but let's give ourselves meaning and purpose. Now, I want your take on this, but one thing that is quite obvious to me is that, well, if you take that road, that road, and you say, well, I'm going to give myself meaning and purpose, all you're essentially doing is you're lying to yourself. You're making things up as you go along, almost like kids play dress up, right? And I don't see how that's...
Yeah, it's an act.
Yeah, it's not solving the problem in any way, shape, or form. You're just trying to convince yourself...
Well, for me... Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, the connection was getting bad. I thought you finished talking.
Sorry, I was just saying that.
Yeah, no, it...
You go, bro. It's your mic, bro.
Yeah, so with regards... No, don't worry. So with regards to this whole quote-unquote meaning creation, it is, as you say, it's an act. It's knowing that what you're doing is insincere, but you're doing it because you've left yourself no choice. Like, well, if life is meaningless, I've just got to make my own meaning. And so you see it, and there's really strange documentaries that kind of show this in play. These very strange things are, when we're talking about them, they're very specific because they're very creative and they're very unique to each individual. And so you might point out this one particular instance, and then someone will say, look, not everyone's doing that. It's just one guy. And it's like, yeah, but this is the issue with it, is that the individual reaction to it is by definition unique. It's individual to each person. And so I might be pointing at this one example, but there's countless examples of this occurring in many different forms, in many different ways with each individual. And so because of the nature of the issue, it's impossible to kind of show how they all connect because the issues are underlying. But you see it in the expression of modern identity politics. You see it in the expression of this drive to self-create. I am who I define myself as. That woman who defined herself as black, and she's white. Her parents are white. There's people that have identified as an alien, others as cats. Some people identifying as unicorn. Vice did a whole documentary following this particular person who identifies as like... He ended up like making this little group of polyamorous unicorns where everyone dresses as a unicorn and they go out and they're like, ooh, we're unicorns. And when you're watching it, you can't help but look at it as insincere, as, you know, and being false, and you can see it in them. There's no, you can tell when you're talking to people whether or not they really believe in what they're doing, whether they actually, 100% hold it as truth in their heart. You know, are they taking this seriously or are they being insincere? And you see it, it's false. And for me, concerned, meaning isn't created, it's discovered. You discover it, it's out there to find. And you find it when you see significance, when you see something, it shines at you. And this is the thing. So people will say, it's subjective. And I have lots of massive issues with the bringing forth of these concepts, subjective and objective. You know, they've got a complex history, and the definition of these things, I don't think the average person really understands. And the theist is just as bad at this, as well as the atheist. They throw these words around, and there's a relationship between the two. And it's when something is significant and it shines forth, that is a subjective experience for that person. and other people might not look at that as significant, but it's objectively the case that this person is experiencing it as significant. You know, there's layers to this thing. You can have the subjective within the objective within the subjective, so on and so forth. And depending on so we can kind of draw this towards the fitra. Depending on the state of the heart, depending on the individual, depending on what direction your heart is inclining, as well as your mind, because there's a balance between the two. And people rely on one too much, or they rely on the other. So some people, they'll only rely on their heart, and they become anti-rationalists, and they're like, no, we can't deal with philosophy at all. We can't deal with thought. Just submit, and that's it. No thinking about it, no questioning, no nothing. And you have other people that incline only to rationality, you know, and you can see it in the expression of some of these YouTubers' names, that they get rid of anything to do with the heart, but they haven't really noticed that it's the heart that's guided them to putting rationality at the top of this thing in the first place.
The concept of the heart's quite it's dead amongst many people. Like they don't even consider it. And you know,
but there are philosophers in the Western tradition that say that reason is guided by the passions, reason is guided by the heart, and it can be, and you need to understand, because there are sometimes where passions can lead you down the wrong direction, and there's sometimes where they can lead you in the right direction, and then the other side of it is sometimes where rationality can lead you to better decisions, and sometimes where it can lead you to the wrong one. And it's about understanding the context and understanding which way you should incline, and that would be what we would call wisdom. And wisdom, you don't need to be massively intelligent. There's people with no education that can be wise. You meet these when you go out, and you if anyone's ever been traveling, you'll meet like very uneducated people, but they're very wise. They're like they know how to deal with people. They're socially intelligent. They're how to like behave. They know how to act in ways that cause less problems or reduce problems. So if there's a big kickoff, they know exactly how to interject. You know, despite not having an education, they know when to be strict. They know when to not be, and so on and so forth. And people are just kind of focused on the wrong things in too much, or way too much sometimes. Yeah. And so tying this back to the fitra. So the question on the screen that you've had, how to respond to who say there is nothing, there is no such thing as the fitra. There's not much you can say to them if they outright deny it. So as far as I can tell, it's these things. It's often fueled by this assumption that you can just kind of press a button and fix people. You know, all it is just a case of all I needed is the right answer. No, like people, they become theists or they become atheists over a very long period of time, depending on a number of things that occur in their life. Certain things become revealed and things become concealed. And so it's not as easy as just having this kind of a long discussion. This is what YouTube is as well. It's like people will come to me and they'll say, oh, well, what's your evidence for Islam? And what do you want? You just want me to give you the button where you just press this and it's like, yeah, I'm a Muslim now. It's not as easy as that. And it's the same when you say to people, oh, well, why are you atheist? They'll give you these little answers. But then there's always these massive presuppositions, and it's like, there's a huge conversation here as to why you've become atheist. And you'll say, oh, well, it's because I saw this as wrong. And it's like, well, what do you mean wrong? What define good, define bad? Like, how are you approaching these concepts? What are you rooting them in? And no matter what direction you're moving in, whether that's towards disbelief or belief, it's a complex conversation that happens over, you know, it's not an instant thing. There's not just like, here to make you become a Muslim, or here's a pamphlet that's going to make you become an atheist. Life is complex. We're dealing with lots of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's powerful about that as well, it reminds humanity to be humble. Humility is such a big key, because it's not in your hands necessarily. It's not the case that you can just reason to, okay, Islam is the truth, and you know Allah exists, and I'm going to be guidance comes from Allah. right? So it's a very important principle people overlook, that there's an element of humility, there's an element of reason, there is an element of where the fitrah comes into play and it checks all of these things. There are many different facets and things that are going on, which should remind the human being at the end of the day, Allah's in control of everything. And the best I can do, or anyone could do, is just to try to be humble, sincere and honest, and just to go on that journey or on that search. And this is why whenever I speak to many of these atheists online that approach you and say, look, prove to me Islam's true, prove to me God exists, you could tell straight away that there is something that it's not right. The way they're approaching it, it's not right. They're not adding things up properly in their head. That approach, that level of arrogance, and that presupposition that my request or my question is what I need for me to be guided, it's wrong. There's so much else that's going to go on. The best thing we could do is, firstly, be sincere and honest, be humble, and just to make that decision to go on that journey and to seek. And if you're sincere and honest, Allah will guide you. You know, it's going to happen. You may be rational, absolutely. It may happen through a powerful rational argument that you come across, and that just triggers your fitrah into, you know, awakens, just recharges you, and you just know it awakens you. It may not be it may not be a rational argument. It may just be an experience that you have in your life, right? It may just be a dream. There's so many different facets to it. But I think one thing that's happened in the world that we live in, bro, is that we've been taught to see the world in a way which is almost like pigeonholing yourself. Like, this is what leads to truth. X leads to truth. Seeing is believing. And these are the ways you need to inquire about the world, full stop, right? And we all think like this. Even Muslims think like this sometimes, unfortunately, right? That's why whenever we think about or talk about giving dawah, dawah training, for example, people are interested in what rational arguments can I share with an atheist or someone to prove God exists? That's maybe an element, but that's not the be-all and end-all of inviting someone to Islam. There is so much that's going on. Human beings are complex beings. We're not robots, right? It's not like you have input and output. There's so much more that's going to happen. So I think that's a good point. So if we could just summarize on this, bro, we'll call it a day here, inshallah, bro, is give the Muslims that are watching this right now, for Muslims first and foremost, some advice as to how they can generally, or how you would advise them to generally approach the atheist that doesn't, you know, doesn't care about meaning and purpose and all of this type of stuff. And secondly, just to round up, if there's any non-Muslims that watch this or are watching, and they've listened to this conversation and something may have triggered them, and they may be thinking, okay, fine, I need to be a little bit humble and open my mind a bit and just to see where I can go with this. Give the non-Muslims some advice as well as to what steps they can take going forward if they're really genuinely in search of the truth.
Okay, so first of all, it might be good actually. There's someone emailed me, and they were asking a couple of questions in particular. So sometimes people will say, I don't believe in God because there's no empirical evidence for God. And they say that quite openly, proudly, as if, you know, I've got the defeater. And then all you need to do is just ask at that point, well, why would you expect the creator to be existent in creation to be able to find it empirically? Because what do we mean when we're talking about empirical evidence? We're talking about evidence in the external world. We're talking about things out there that we can touch, we can see, we can measure, we can prod with scientific instruments. And if God exists, what we're talking about, the transcendent being that gave rise to creation and is distinct from creation, isn't found within it. In the same way that the painter isn't found in the painting, the same way that the computer game generator or developer isn't to be found inside of the game. Like, to ask for empirical evidence for God is, first of all, not understanding one of two things: either what empirical evidence is, or what God is, or what we're saying God is. And then after that, they'll say, everything can be explained by natural means. And it's like, well, can it? Do you have empirical evidence for that everything can be explained for natural means? Because you keep going back down the line. Eventually, you get to these theories about either creation ex nihilo, the universe came to being from nothing, like what's that guy called? Krauss? Whatever. Lawrence Krauss. Like he tries to posit. Or you get to the idea of the multiverse. Neither of these theories have empirical evidence. And by definition, you wouldn't be able to get empirical evidence for them, because we're talking about that which occurred before T0, before the Big Bang, before the beginning of this particular universe that we're in. We're talking about things beyond the realm or beyond the horizon of our experience, beyond the horizon of what's possibly empirical. So you have here for the atheist or the non-believer an inconsistency. You know, they're expecting empirical evidence for God, despite him being, you know, beyond that point where empirical evidence is available. He's transcendent. He's not in the world. And so, you know, you can't just prod him in the same way that there is no empirical evidence for the theory that the universe came to be from nothing. In the same way that there is no empirical evidence for the multiverse. It's, you know, that people have used reason to kind of deduce that this is the case. You know, but the atheist is quite happy to submit to one of those two theories, which they generally do. You know, they'll, you know, if you're making the claim that everything can be explained by natural terms, you're already submitting to the fact that you had to accept one of those two. And none of these have been given by empirical evidence. So there's an inconsistency there. With regards to, what was the other question?
So for Muslims engaging with atheists that don't believe in any meaning or purpose to life, what would you advise them?
First of all, so be patient with them. These things, some people are going to be dogmatic, whether they're believers or non-believers. You know, like some people are just stuck in the mud in whatever position they happen to be in. You know, there are critical thinkers in the atheists that might eventually, in time, become theists, and then there's theists that, in time, like thinking critically about things, become atheists. And there's this flow constantly from one group to the other, and you are not in control of how that occurs. So you need to kind of understand that sometimes there isn't anything you can do, full stop. And sometimes it might just be a case of you're wasting time with each other. And this is advice for the atheist trying to convince the theist as much as it is the other way around. Some people are just beyond a discussion with, end off. And, you know, whether you're an atheist dealing with a theist or a theist dealing with an atheist, you've got to be able to identify when you've come to this. And either at that point, you need to just say salam and, you know, peace, and move in opposite directions. Or you learn to deal with each other reasonably, you know, and maybe continue these conversations over a long period of time, which, you know, involves patience. And then just kind of exploring these things and understanding that, like, this arrogance of, there's some of these that pop about on Twitter that they'll say, oh, don't shroud God in mystery. It's like, what are you talking about? Shroud God in mystery. What you expect the finite to be able to comprehend the infinite, and you want an explanation that's something I can put in a pamphlet. And if it's not pamphletable, it's not true. That's absurd. That's an absurd way of thinking. Why should the infinite not be mysterious? By definition, why do you think that the finite is able to comprehend everything? And even if we're not talking about God, even if we're just talking from an atheistic perspective, the fact that you can't comprehend the multiverse, you know, this infinite string of universes, you know, they wouldn't argue that just because you can't comprehend the multiverse that it's false. So why is it that they're holding this, again, an inconsistency, a standard that they hold to the theist? No, if you're going to tell me that God exists, you need to tell me exactly how God exists. You need to not shroud it in mystery and tell me that it's something that might be incomprehensible. There are lots of things that are incomprehensible. Just because they're incomprehensible doesn't falsify them.
You're right with the consistencies, bro, and this should highlight to us that there's other things going on inside the human being as well. It's not just a rational issue, because, like you said, if you're being consistent, there's many other things you like. Let's face it, most of us don't know how our digestive systems function properly, right? We use them every single day of our lives, but we don't know. Most of these atheists that challenged or want to understand God inside out and all of the reality of God inside out, they don't even know how their basic bodily functions take place on a daily basis, right? But
not
you
knowing that, it doesn't mean they have to reject it.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, it shows, okay, there's an inconsistency here. Why the inconsistency? Well, at least to me or to most of us, it should make us realize that, well, there may be something else going on. Are they genuinely even wanting to know, or is it just a case of making themselves feel, you know, just giving themselves a bit of a, okay, yeah, you're on the right path, it's fine, keep going the way you're going, just to make themselves certain of the, or give themselves a sense of false certainty of the position that they hold right now. There's again, bro, there's so much to discuss here, man.
Yeah.
I think
I'll finish on this one little bit. Bro. So most of the tension in apologetics is just down to impatience. It's just down to arrogance. People thinking that they have the power to change everyone. A lot of it, you just need to take a step back. You just need, whether you're theist, atheist, whatever, just relax. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Whoever, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide who he wills, and he will misguide who he wills. And you have your part to play in that, but the final decision isn't up to you. You know, the people make their own decisions. An atheist, determined to be an atheist is going to stay one. A theist determined to be a theist is going to stay one. And there's going to be a flux between them. And all you can do is your best. All you can do is engage in conversations, engage in dawah, and have these discussions. You'll find no matter what it is you're talking about, there's this leap of faith for everyone. And I go into this in my dissertation. In the second part, I talk about the necessity of a leap of faith. That it's made necessary by our being limited, by our being finite beings, by the fact that we do not have access to all knowledge, by the fact that we're not God. We have to make leap of faiths. We're stuck there. And even if it turns out that the world is a nihilistic world, which I really don't think it is, but say we accept it for the sake of argument for the moment, that God doesn't exist, everything is pointless, everything is meaningless. Even then, you still make jumps here and there. Even if the atheist wants to hold, and they hate this word, they hate belief, they hate faith. They paint it as a dirty word, but they're riddled with it. They're absolutely riddled with it. So just chill, relax, talk to each other, be humble, be patient, and just work through it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will.
Inshallah. Brilliant advice. Jazakallah khair, Yusuf, bro. Before everyone leaves, make sure to check out Yusuf's channel. We will link it or just put it in the comment section at the bottom, bro, so everyone can find your channel. Also, I'll be doing these live streams more regularly, so I think I've got 2 next week, so make sure to check them out. They've already been posted or scheduled on my page. That's it. So any other questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I'm sure Yusuf, if there's anything directed towards him, he'll be more than happy to respond to you guys and provide you with some answers. Inshallah. And until next time, take care.
Apologies for neglecting the chat.
We tried, but it's just I'll get better at this as we go along. Inshallah. Get used to it. All right, Yusuf, take care. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Take care.